Hello and welcome to Fowl Plays, where we look at tales of tabletop tragedy that are sure to ruffle some feathers. I'm your host, Boss Goose, and in today's story, we have a player who isn't interested in participating in the campaign whenever the focus isn't on them, spending a majority of her time either watching videos online or separating from the party in order to pursue her own interests, often causing the DM to have to repeat themselves so that she knows what's going on, and getting angry when things don't go exactly the way she wants them to, calling OP's abilities as DM into question. So take a seat and wet your beaks as we dive on into today's tale. This is going to be a very long-winded story. I apologize in advance, you've been warned. Some of you may know me as the original DM or Shifter Wizard from my buddy my dude's few stories. Thanks to her posts, I honestly feel I could share my story here on how things got to the point it did in the campaign that imploded in on itself by giving just a glimpse into what happened on the final session before we switched over to the Fighter's homebrew game, and also why a switch was needed in the first place. I highly recommend you read her stories because it'll give you context, but it won't be necessary for you to understand this horror story specifically, only aid in giving you a better picture. So this deserves a little backstory. I knew Fighter for a long time before this campaign ever started. Fighter was in my very first D&D game, with my other small circle of IRL friends that introduced me to the wonderful and magical world of TTRPGs. Needless to say, not only was I fond of Fighter, but I considered them a truly great friend for a very long time. Over the years, I had seen the red flags and had been warned by that same small circle of friends that Fighter could be difficult. But I elected to ignore that because Fighter had a lot happen to her in life, and I was sympathetic to her plight, and I didn't want to exclude her from anything. She eventually moved away, and me and the IRL group continued playing long after she did. After quite some time, we found each other again over the internet, and we talked a lot. I considered her to be a really good friend, and basically every day we would end up talking at least over Discord, if not on the phone. As time went on, Fighter was basically telling me how alone she felt and how she really wished she could play more D&D like we all used to. However, the IRL circle wouldn't play with her anymore, especially online, and I wasn't too fond of it either after all that had happened the last time we tried. Story for another time. However, my bleeding heart won, and I invited her to play in a homebrew game I was making for two of my other friends. One I met in college, and also my buddy my dude, who I met through a Facebook D&D looking for group page. And this, I thought, would help her not feel so isolated. COVID wasn't a thing, but at the time of the events, it was full swing and the isolation was worse. And make some new friends. I was so very wrong. Now, on to the actual game part. Okay, so the way I structure my games is to break them into 4 seasons. Each tier of play, click here if you're not sure what that means, would be a season, with each having its own season boss and a larger story that spans over all 4 seasons to make the entire campaign, ending with your PCs becoming epic heroes, ascending to the status of a deity, something I have in my game universe set up. I can explain further in the comments if anyone's interested, but alas. Or whatever they want as they save the world and multiverse from impending doom. I like big cinematic endings, so sue me, lol. The reason I do this is I can make a really bare bones plotline that has like the basic structure of the game, but tries its best to be fluid enough so that I can adapt to anything the party throws at me, and let them feel important and like their involvement is not only important but paramount to the story. I have an idea for the ending, but I only need to hardcore plan story beats session by session because the overall story can be altered drastically by the players. It's a win-win for me. Now, because I do that, Season, aka Tier 1, is you dealing with threats on a very local level. Nothing major will be happening in the realm at large, but you need to make a name for yourself before people trust you with anything bigger. Enter our cast of characters. Wood Elf Cleric, my buddy my dude's character, and one of my favorite PCs I've ever DM'd for. She was relatively new, and this was her first actual full campaign she was playing. The only others were one-shots and a Lost Mines of Phandelver run that ended after losing most of the players, which I DM'd, and which is how we knew each other. Changeling Druid, college friend's character who was still relatively new to D&D and was still very shy, so she played a very muted character till combat broke out. In which case, she had the most insane fucking rolls in all of TTRPG history, and often accidentally killed a lot of bad guys. Oh well. Custom Race Fighter. Fighter was the most experienced in D&D of all of us, and made sure to let everyone know that. Fighter's character was a homebrew race made by Fighter, which I helped balance and allowed, and for the most part, it was actually really fun to DM for, character-wise. I won't post the name of the race for anonymity for her, and it would easily be linked back to her. She and I might not be friends anymore, but I'm not a dick like that. Now, Session 0 went swimmingly for everyone, and I enjoyed incorporating everyone's backstory into the game. Especially if I can have their backstories affect a later tier, like creating a personal villain or situation that really calls to them later on. Session 1 came, and everyone seemed to mesh well enough. Fighter is brash in-game, but not too much that it would be a problem, and I felt like she was really getting a lot from the game. It's important to note that the custom race she made is weird with age. She was essentially like 5 years old, but had an adult body, and was still learning about the world, so the brashness makes a little sense with that in mind. And was making some of my friends her own friends, and generally everyone was getting along well. I genuinely believe that regardless of the issues me and Fighter had from before when we played together, she really had changed and wasn't as bad as she used to be. When the next few sessions came, the red flags came with it too. Fighter became way more brash, way more assertive, yet only when something directly involved something that Fighter, out of character, thought was interesting. Otherwise, she would basically fuck off on her phone or computer. Mind you, this is over Discord and voice, and clearly wasn't paying attention unless she heard her character's name. She rationalized this as, "I'm just playing in character. These things wouldn't interest characters' names, so she isn't paying attention, and I don't want to metagame." I should have seen the red flag here, to be honest. But anyway, we worked through it. Party kills some bears that threaten the local area, engage in some brief local politics. The druid kills a thug by ripping the chain that was attached to his ear and nose and literally MMA'd his ass to the floor, and chokes him to death because they tried to hurt a party favorite NPC and his sick little boy. Cleric went full Negan on Thug 2 for hurting the little boy of his fave NPC and smashed her weapon into his skull. She was a former member of a big-time mafia family and wanted to run away from that life after her wife had died. But you know how the mafia life is. And Fighter? Oh yeah, Fighter decided to split from the party and do her own thing, claiming she wanted to turn the quests into the Adventurers Guild, but really just wanted to have her own thing going on. Missing the whole fight and only showed up after it was over. This was not a single occurrence. Fighter often left the party to pursue her own agenda, and it was getting on everyone's nerves. Well, time goes on, plot stuff happens, involving the party deciding that, nah, adventuring is lame. Let's start an economic rebellion. Another long story for another time, but again, not terribly important right now. And eventually they learn of this orc bodyguard of the town's de facto mayor that is just a little more than shifty, and he carries a really nasty looking sword that has this bad aura around it. They are tasked, a member of a small group of freedom fighters, to track this bodyguard and find out what he knows, because he clearly has some evil plan. By this time, Fighter has been checking out any time she isn't in the same area, and now not even responding correctly when she is mentioned, and makes me repeat myself often to catch her up at points. And will often cut everyone off mid-RP to show us a video or meme she found while everyone else was playing. We're starting to see a pattern, and we don't like. Around this time, we're about level 3, and I'm planning their level 5 boss fight. And I happened to talk to the old DM I had in the circle of IRL friends to get his opinion on a good final dungeon and boss encounter. Now, old DM and Fighter do not like each other in the sense of D&D. Fighter thinks that old DM makes his fights way too hard for the sake of being hard, and I can attest sometimes it really does feel that way. But I have always liked the way he thinks with dungeons and encounters, even if I have to scale them back. This becomes important later. Now, I'm trying at this point to kinda nudge them in the direction that every NPC and plot hook is leading, and 2 of the 3 are eating it up, wanting to follow the orc who has just left the city and has a head start on them to these ancient ruins on an island where a supposed great artifact of power lies, that will cement the one who holds it as the ruler of the local area, and they want to give it to the mayor, whom they really think is trying to make a difference but needs legitimacy. Everyone is on board, except Fighter, who isn't really interested because there are other plot hooks seeded that were story relevant to her individually, and she wanted to pursue those instead. Fuck these townsfolks, am I right? Anyway, they eventually get Fighter to come along on a ship headed to the island the orc is headed to. I had to dangle a carrot of her own personal stuff to get her to agree that it might be worthwhile for her to come with the party. And this was the beginning of the end. On the way there, they find a stowaway. It's actually a Ganassi who has been trapped in a magic disc for many years that Fighter cracks open and yeets into the sea. But again, plot stuff that isn't really important. Story stuff happens, and they decide to keep this stowaway contained and question him later. In the middle of the night, they hear the sound of some kind of scuffle on the deck of the ship, and suddenly a splash. Everyone gets up, realize it's the Ganassi overboard, and all the party jumps in to try to get him, only to realize something large has him in its tentacly grasp. A leviathan that is clearly overleveled for them. But even still, there's something about its eyes and parts of its body. They are glowing milky white. Something that, up to this point, had been shown to be happening to members of a cult when they get possessed, that worshipped something evil but was intended for a later season. So this was clearly being controlled, but I also will acknowledge that I could have made it more clear if anyone had made any kind of nature check or anything, which didn't happen. This creature was purely after the Ganassi for culty reasons, but they still wanted to try and rescue him against better judgment. Now, this thing would never have killed them, but I knew that without any risks, this would break the immersion. There needed to be some kind of stakes, and they had a good plan. They just didn't have anything to really help them breathe underwater. Besides the druid, who I allowed to change into a large enough fish to help bring the others to the surface. The monster almost one-shots the cleric, which I reduced the damage for cause this was not a party dies moment, only to demonstrate the immense power this thing has. Fighter starts to complain here that the monster is too powerful, to which I agree, and that clearly the best course of action is to leave the Ganassi to a watery fate, but that's a no-go for the party. Fighter then proceeds to hack away at the tentacle holding the Ganassi, underwater, in its natural habitat. The following is the conversation as I can remember it. Fighter: I hit it with my sword. Me: okay, roll with disadvantage for swinging a sword underwater. Fighter makes a few bad rolls. I'll never hit with disadvantage. Guess I'll just die here. Me: well, you're trying to swing a sword underwater, and you're just not getting enough oomph behind it to really do anything. Fighter immediately gives up. Only out of character though, as she continues to try to hack this tentacle in-game. However, the rest of the party has a plan to pry the Ganassi from the monster, and it works. Great thinking, y'all. Even I didn't plan for that, and I am impressed. Everyone gets back on the ship, and everyone is like, wow, I can't believe that worked. Session ends. After session, we discuss the game, and Fighter, who has been silent till now, yells at me in front of everyone. Fighter: that was bullshit. There was no way to kill that thing. Me: I mean, yeah, it wasn't something to fight head on, and clearly it was after the Ganassi and under the command of the cult. Remember the milky eyes and glow? But I mean, you guys went at it smart and pried the tentacle open and succeeded. That's a win. Fighter: anything that lives down there would have bioluminescence. I know, I have a background in marine biology. I didn't know that it was being controlled by the cult. Me: okay, well, no one asked to make any rolls to see anything about it. Also, I'm admittedly not a marine biologist, so... Also, in hindsight, there's zero way that Fighter in character would have had the knowledge, but whatever. Fighter: whatever, you're just being like old DM and making impossible fights for the sake of being hard. We argue on this point for a moment, things get a little heated for me, but we end it there and move on. Now, I am a little irritable, and one thing I should have done was maybe nudge the new players to make more checks, and I realize that now. But not every fight is winnable, at least not head on. But whatever, right? Maybe it was just an off day. The next session was made to be one of a 3 to 4 part finale, the dungeon crawl and final showdown. Now, unbeknownst to the party, the orc was actually being controlled by the evil sword that he carried. However, once a month, the control of the sword lessens enough so that he can act mostly autonomously. And he had convinced the sword, as they shared a consciousness when the sword was at full strength, to come to the island to find the possible location of a different sword, one of the opposing alignments, and acquire the means to destroy it via the artifact. Only the orc wanted to use the artifact to free himself from the sword's control. Unfortunately, the artifact couldn't do this, however the orc knew that the others were not far behind. He only needed to wait for them to arrive, and maybe he could reach out to them before the sword takes over again. AKA, he would spew exposition, T Season 2, but the sword takes over and then boss fight. Around this time, I'm thinking to myself, You know, maybe the whole Leviathan thing was my fault. Maybe we can see if Fighter wants to DM her own campaign, and I can learn from her DMing. I haven't been in her games longer than a session or two because of the others, and maybe she just needs her time to shine. So I asked Fighter if after this season we can take a break and maybe she can take over as DM, to which she agreed. This would go well. Note, this did not go well at all. I happened to mention to Fighter outside the game that I was excited for the final sessions, and I had even had old DM help me with some ideas, but not to worry because I only did it to see what he would do and compare it to what I made. In hindsight, this is exactly where I went wrong. I never should have said a damn thing about it, but I shoulder at least part of the blame, especially after last session's comments. This, obviously, did not go over well with Fighter, who proceeded to tell me they just plain weren't interested in playing anything that old DM had any hand in making. To which I was like, honestly, I didn't even incorporate anything they mentioned. I simply wanted to gauge it off his own difficulty scale on one monster, to see if it was okay, because if he was like, that's exactly what I would do, I know it's probably too hard. All this went in one ear and out the other. It was already too late. All through the dungeon crawl, Fighter is constantly huffing and puffing and not engaging, actively walking into rooms without even bothering to check for anything, and basically just giving up in fights and spamming the Discord with memes and stupid shit instead of paying attention. Basically, waltzing through this dungeon without a care in the world. I ask her if she's okay in a PM, and this was the exchange. Me: is everything okay? You seem out of it. Fighter: no, I'm just not excited for this game at all right now. I just want to get it over with. Me: I don't know what you want me to do. If you as a player don't want to engage, I as a DM don't know what's in my power to do for you. Fighter: don't act like this is my fault. I'm not a bad player. You're a terrible DM. So, I kind of shut down. I condensed this epic 4-level dungeon into a single floor. Sent them immediately to the orc because really, I was just hurt. I had planned all this out trying my best, and someone whose opinion that I really cared about at the time when it came to D&D just told me that I was terrible at it. So I was kind of like, just done. However, I figured I can at least give the other two players the big reveal from the orc, and they wouldn't know any better, so at least there would be that, and I can just move on from here. But wait, there's more. PCs get to the boss room, and before anyone can fucking speak, Fighter, against the wishes of the entire party, immediately rushes in and attacks the boss. Boss has zero time to speak, and clearly Fighter just wants to be done with the game. But I am trying for the others to have him pull anything to give him a moment to speak, in which he asks for them to just talk. Fighter isn't having it and just goes ham on the orc, and the party joins in, figuring they can't stop Fighter anyway. I give up. Run the fight, get them back to the ship, give them a few little things they were getting from the dungeon besides the orc thing, and end the session when they arrive back in town to see things are now going wrong on a bigger scale. But inside, I was kinda just dead. I didn't want to play anymore. I was crushed that everything was happening at once, and I was over it. So that's how our Tier 1 game ended, and we went on to play the Fighters game, which was terrible. And then tried to come back to this game, and, well, y'all know how that turned out. So, yeah. TLDR, invited old friend that's shown red flags in RPGs previously to a game with newbies. She gets pissy when she's not the center of attention, barely plays the game, gets mad when she makes bad decisions, and berates me for being a bad DM. This was a long one. Going through this, Fighter exhibited a lot of that guy tendencies from early on. It always bugs me when someone doesn't pay attention or isn't present during a campaign. It's really disrespectful to everyone else at the table, and especially towards the DM, who works hard to create an immersive setting for everyone to enjoy and experience. The Fighter seemed to have a chip on her shoulder right from the get-go, with her abandoning the party whenever it suited her, and not getting directly involved unless the DM mentioned her by name. The cracks really started to show though during the encounter on the boat. Jumping into the ocean to fight a Leviathan when you're not even level 5, and then getting upset that you can't do anything, is pretty immature. Not every encounter is going to be a winnable fight, and it wasn't intended to be. The hints were there that things weren't all what they seemed, and the rest of the party proved that some creative thinking was all that was needed to succeed. Personally, I think D&D would be a very boring game if every encounter was just attack, 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 dead, on to the next. Even if you're a martial class, you can get creative and make for some great moments if you just take a moment to assess the situation and think outside of the box about what you can do. I feel bad for OP in this situation. It sounds like they tried really hard to craft an interesting story and wanted to share it with the people they cared about. So it really sucks when Fighter turned around and blamed them for her own shortcomings, saying that they were a crappy DM, when all OP was trying to do was see if she was okay because she wasn't really engaged in what was going on. It's definitely not something I would think a friend would say to another, at least not without a constructive reason, and it clearly hit the DM really hard to hear that from someone that they respected. I haven't read the other stories that are out there about these players yet, so I am curious to see how this trend continues, but for now, I do hope the DM was eventually able to move past this and begin a new adventure with players who appreciated their efforts. Anyways, thanks for checking out my video and sticking around till the end. I hope you enjoyed yourselves. I upload new content every Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday, so make sure you check out my channel for more D&D stories. And if you like this video, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave me a goosebump in the comments below. The support is greatly appreciated. But until next time, be good players.